What's up everyone? Today's video is all about Entity Framework Core. What we're going to do is we're going to take a CRUD-based REST API that's currently working with storing the entities in memory in a dictionary, and instead of that use Entity Framework Core. This video is going to cover everything that you need to know to get started with Entity Framework Core today, what the different NuGet packages do, how to use the .NET CLI tool to work with Entity Framework Core, and also various other things that you should know if you're just getting started with Entity Framework Core today. If you're new to the channel, then first of all, welcome. My name is Amichai. I do have a quick disclaimer that even though I work at Microsoft, I'm not talking on behalf of Microsoft. And also, if you're watching this and you're not subscribed yet, then make sure to pause the video, smash that subscribe button if you don't want to miss out on videos about coding, architecture, and various other coding related stuff that you might enjoy. So what we're going to use for today's video is the Boober Breakfast application. If you haven't watched the video where we build this CRUD-based REST API in 1 hour, then I'll link it over here. Make sure to check it out if that's something that you care about. What it currently does is, like we said, it works with an in-memory dictionary of entities, and we're going to use Entity Framework Core instead. So to get started, all you need to do is clone that GitHub repository. It's public on my GitHub. So all you need to do is say git clone and then select the Boober Breakfast repository. Click this. This will clone the application. And now we can open it in Visual Studio Code. Okay, so I have our project open in Visual Studio Code. And if you just want to catch up and understand what we did in the previous video, then you can simply look at the README file that has here everything that you need to know to get started now, right? So what the different endpoints look like, what requests you need to make, and so on. And if you want to play around with it a bit, then you can open the requests folder, which has here the various requests, and you can simply run the project, make requests, and see how it behaves. So to get started, we have the two projects, the Boober Breakfast project that has all our logic, and the contracts project for our API definition. Then we have our breakfast service that contains the actual logic of storing the breakfast in the in-memory dictionary of breakfast. Now, what we're currently doing is we simply have this static dictionary, and we're manipulating this dictionary to store the breakfast locally in memory, right? So we're doing it over here, and we're doing it everywhere else. Now, let's switch this to work with Entity Framework Core. So the first thing we want to do is we want to add the main Entity Framework Core package, which is simply .NET add, and then we need to select the project. In our case, it's the Boober Breakfast project, and the package that we want to add is simply Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore, and that's it. Let's run this. This will add the NuGet package to our CS project. Okay, now that we have that, let's go back to our service and create here a new folder. Let's call it persistence. And inside here, let's create our DB context. Now, this video is suited for complete beginners, so don't worry. You're going to understand everything that we're presenting today. We'll go back to the theory in a few minutes. So over here, let's create the DB context. So let's give it a unique name for our project. Let's call it Boober Breakfast DB context. Okay, so that's a public class Boober Breakfast DB context, and this is going to implement the DB context from Entity Framework Core that we just added, right? And now there are a few things that we need to do. First of all, we need to create a constructor that we'll call the base constructor in the DB context. So let's accept this, delete what we don't need, and let's walk through what we have. So this, the DB set, we can look at it like a list of breakfasts. That's from our point of view, we're manipulating it as if it's simply sitting in memory. Okay, now, of course, this isn't what actually happens. Behind the scenes, we have some database provider that converts whatever actions that we do on this DB set to whatever database provider that we're working with. So this might be SQL, this might be API calls, and it's very important to understand what actually happens behind the scenes. Okay, so that's the DB set. And over here, we're simply calling the base constructor and passing it the options over here. Maybe let's put on a new line so it's visible. And that's everything we're going to have for now. Great, so we have our DB context. Now let's manipulate the breakfast service to satisfy what we're doing over there, but instead of using the in-memory dictionary like we're doing over here, we'll use Entity Framework Core. So let's close this, we have a bit more room. Let's get rid of this, and instead let's say over here, private read-only. This is going to be the Boober Breakfast DB context. Yes, the second option. And let's call it simply DB context. Let's create a constructor and pass it via dependency injection. So we have our DB context. Now let's use it instead of the dictionary. So we have over here the DB context. over here, what we want to do is we want to add it to the database. So let's say db context, and let's say simply add, and let's pass it the breakfast. Because of course this isn't enough. We haven't stored anything in the database yet. What we want to do is call save changes that will actually execute the command, whether it's SQL, whether it's an API call, whether it's something against a document DB or a relational DB. We don't know yet at this stage. We'll get to that in a few minutes. So let's say over here, DB context and save changes that will actually store the breakfast in the database. So we have that. Let's move on to delete breakfast. Okay, so over here we have some ID. What we're going to do for now, this isn't the most optimal. We're going to check if it exists in the database. If it doesn't exist, we'll return not found from this method. Otherwise, we will delete it. So let's say over here, breakfast, yes, and then we want to find the breakfast by the ID. This will return the breakfast. So over here, we are executing some command to retrieve the details from the database. Then over here, we want to say that if the breakfast is null, then we don't have a breakfast. The find method will return null. If there's no breakfast, then we can say over here, return errors.breakfast.not found, and this will return that error. Otherwise, we know we have the breakfast over here, and we can simply call remove. So now we can say db context and then remove and pass it the breakfast. The next thing we want to do is again call save changes for it to actually be persisted in the database. So db context and save changes, and now it's actually stored in the database, and we can return deleted over here. Great. Moving on to get breakfast, then very similar to what we did before. So what we want to see over here is db context, and we want to say breakfast. Then we want to find by the ID if this is a breakfast. Then we simply want to return it over here. Otherwise, we want to return not found. Okay, moving on to upsert breakfast. So what we have over here is the following. We're returning error or upserted breakfast. This is a response that we created, and this upserted breakfast has the is newly created property that indicates whether we just created a new breakfast or not. That's because the HTTP specification for put is that we return 201 created if we just created a new breakfast when we called the put method, or we return 204 no content if we upserted a breakfast, if we made some changes to an existing resource. So we have this, and this is so we know to return the appropriate response in the controller. So we have this. What we want to do over here is we want to check if the breakfast exists in the database. If it exists, then we want to update it and return this with is newly created true. Otherwise, we want to return with false. So let's say over here, let's get rid of this entire thing. And let's say over here, db context, and let's say breakfast, and let's try finding the breakfast with a given ID. And if it is not a breakfast, let's say db breakfast. So we know it doesn't exist in the database, and now we are creating a new breakfast. Okay, now that we have this, then we can say if it is newly created, then we can add the breakfast to the database. Otherwise, we simply want to update the breakfast. So now we can say db context and then breakfast, and now we can say add and pass it the breakfast. Same thing like before in the create breakfast method. Otherwise, let's say that we want to do the same thing, but we want to update the breakfast. Last thing we want to do is we want to call over here save changes that will actually persist the changes that we did. And the last thing we want to do is return the value of the is newly created, so we know to return the correct status from the controller. Now, if you're familiar with Entity Framework Core, then there are a few things over here that, first of all, won't work, aren't efficient, and can be done better. So we'll talk about these as the video goes on. Kind of reminding you that the Boober Breakfast project is the young brother of the Boober Dinner project, the advanced series where we're building a REST API completely from scratch using clean architecture and domain-driven design. What this is now is just to get you up to speed with everything you need to know to get started today and use Entity Framework Core in simple CRUD-based applications. But using Entity Framework Core together with domain-driven design is tricky. There are a lot of things that you need to know, especially when it comes to configuring and mapping and so on. So I want us to tackle the simple things now so you're up to speed and you can join for the advanced topics that we're going to talk about later. So now that we have this, then like we said, there are things here that aren't going to work, but we still have some things to learn ahead of us. So The next thing we want to do is we want to define what our database provider is, because at the moment we have our DB context, we haven't added it to the dependency injection IOC container yet, nothing is wired together, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's go to the program CS where we're setting up our services, and over here let's say builder.services, and we want to add the DB context. The DB context that we want to add is the Boober breakfast DB context, and let's accept this. And let's get rid of all of this for now, because I want us to explain it as we go on. So this will add it to the dependency injection IOC container, but we need to define what the database provider is. So for that, what we want to do is we want to take over here the options and use it to configure what it is. Now, if you aren't using ASP.NET Core, then this exists also inside this object. So over here, you have a method that's called onConfiguring that you can call. So you can simply say over here, override onConfiguring, and then over here you have the DB context options builder. That is the same object that we're using over here. Okay, so I want us to visualize it. So for that, let's take a look again at our diagram. We have the Boober breakfast client, looks something like this, and it's trying to create a new breakfast. So it's calling the post endpoint, and it's passing the details of the breakfast. Then this arrives at our backend service. And currently what we're doing is we're simply storing everything over here inside the breakfast service. But like we said, we don't like that. We want to use the DB context instead. Now, the DB context, or Entity Framework Core in general, it's a layer of abstraction above the database provider, which is actually the implementation that will store things in whatever database that you're using. Now, out of the box, if you're using ASP.NET Core, then you get the in-memory database that you can use and simply define that that's the database provider that you're going to use with your DB context. We'll look at that in a minute. But what we're going to do today is we're going to use Sqlite. This will create a local file that the data will be stored in. But there are many providers for basically any database that you want to use. Over here, I put just some of them, but there are more other than this. And it's important to understand that when you're working with the DB context, then you're working with a layer of abstraction that is a heavy abstraction where you're simply using link, and the actual action that happens behind the scenes varies based on the provider. And based on the provider that you choose, you need to understand what is actually created when you're creating migrations, what the migrations look like. So we'll look at that in a minute, but I just want to emphasize it again and again as we go on, because again, this is an introductory video, and these are things that are important to know when starting to work with Entity Framework Core. So great, we have that out of the way. It's visualized. We know exactly what's going on. So let's go back to the project. And over here, let's say options, and let's say which database provider we want to use. So over here, yes, we can say use Sqlite, and this will use the SQLite database provider. But as you're probably familiar with the .NET ecosystem, then things are broken up into NuGet packages, so you don't include symbols and things that you don't need. So for that, we need to add another NuGet package that is for the specific provider. Based on the provider that you're using, you'll need to add a different NuGet package. So let's say over here, .NET add, and then yes, this, and over here, let's say we want the SQLite provider. This will add that NuGet package to our application, and now we're good to go. So we have this configured. Let's try creating our first migration. If you're not familiar with migrations, then all it is the definition of how you're going to update your database. Every time you update your database, then you create a new migration. And that's the definition of when you move from one version of the database schema to the next version, then what that conversion is going to look like, both when you're going up to the next version and when you're going down to the previous version. So let's go ahead and try to create a migration. For that, we're going to use the .NET Entity Framework Core tool for the command line. So let's go ahead and add it. You can check if you have it installed by saying .NET tool. Then you can list all the tools that you have installed globally. And in my case, I already have it installed, so you can see it over here. Okay, now every .NET CLI tool that starts with .NET and then a dash, then you can either invoke it, like it says over here with the short name. This tool has all my various socials. So if you want to install it and you're curious what my social is for, let's say, GitHub, then you can run this and you'll get it, but that's for another day. So you can simply write either the short name to invoke it, like we just did with the AM, or you can say .NET and then EF, and that's what we're going to do. So to create a new migration, what you want to do is you want to say .NET and then migrations. Then you want to say the migration name. In our case, it's going to be yes, initial create, and you need to specify the project if the project doesn't exist in the folder that you're in. So in our case, yes, we want to use the Boober Breakfast project. You can either write it explicitly like we did over here, or you can simply say -p as well. So let's do that. And over here, let's say Boober Breakfast. Okay, so doing this, we'll try to create a migration. Let's see if this works. Okay, so it didn't work, and that's because when the Entity Framework command line tool tried to build the project and create the migration definition, we'll look at that in a few minutes, then it uses the Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.Design NuGet package, and we don't have it installed. So let's go ahead and add it to our project as well. So let's say .NET add, and then we want to say to the Boober Breakfast, we want to add the package, and then we want this thing, but in the end, we want design. So let's invoke this. This will add that NuGet package to our application, and then we can try again. Okay, so it finished adding it. Let's go ahead and try running it again, and let's see if it works. Okay, so while this is building, I just want to recap. So we added 3 NuGet packages altogether. We added the base Entity Framework Core package, which is Microsoft.EntityFramework. Then we added the design package, and that's for building the migration or building the definition of the migration. Then we added the SQLite database provider because that's the database provider that we decided to use. And that contains not only the logic of the provider, but also this extension method on the options builder that allows us to use it as our database provider for our DB context. Okay, so we did this, and now we see that we have a failure, and the failure is no suitable constructor was found for entity type breakfast. So let's look at our breakfast, and let's look at our constructor definition and try to understand why this doesn't work. So looking at the constructor definition, then we can see it's private, and we have over here many arguments to the constructor. And this doesn't work because what happens is that when Entity Framework Core tries to materialize the breakfast object, based in our case, we have the table, so we have columns and rows. When it tries to take the data that's stored over there and materialize it into a breakfast object, then it tries to use some constructor, and it doesn't know how to do it with this given constructor. So what you'll see many times in projects that use Entity Framework Core is the following. You'll simply see private and then breakfast, and this is going to be used by Entity Framework Core when it creates a new breakfast object. Now, you might be asking yourself, how does it work if it's private? And the answer is that with Entity Framework Core, many of the things happen with reflection. So it's going to use reflection to actually populate the breakfast object. Another thing that we're going to have to do, and let's get it ready out of the way, is to add private setters for all these properties, because when it's going to add values to these properties, and also when it builds the migration definition, then it's going to look at this object or look at the class definition, then iterate over all the properties and use that to create the definition of the database. So let's go ahead and change everywhere where it says get to be instead get and then private set, right? Great, so we have that out of the way. And now Entity Framework Core should have what it wanted. So let's try running this again and see if it works. Okay, so we ran it again and it didn't work. And if we look at the failure, then we can see that the entity type list of string requires a primary key to be defined. So like we see over here, we have here our 2 lists of strings. One of them is for the savory items, one of them is for the sweet items. And what happened is that we have here a one-to-many relationship. So we have many savory items for every breakfast. Same thing goes for the sweet. And we need to decide how this is going to be stored in the database. So we can either decide that we want a table and the items to be stored over there, or we can do something else and basically define how the conversion to the database is going to look like and the conversion from the database is going to look like, and then use that instead. So for that, let's go ahead and do the following. So inside the DB context class, let's go ahead and use the onModelCreating method to customize how we're going to configure our object. So we have the onModelCreating. Yes, let's accept this. And now we can use the model builder to decide what our database is going to look like. So what the name of the table is, what the columns are going to look like. We can add here different columns. We can remove columns. We can ignore properties and so on. There's many things that we can do over here. And this is the place to do it. So we have the model builder. And when we want to make changes to the breakfast type, then we can say over here, entity, and then select, yeah, for example, the breakfast type. And over here we have has key, but we can also say stuff about the different properties and configure them. Now, because sometimes you're going to have only one DB set, but sometimes you're going to have a lot or more than one. And also sometimes the objects are going to be very big and you're going to have a lot of configurations over here. Then it can become a mess doing all these configurations over here. So instead of that, we're going to take a different approach, which is create over here a new folder, and let's call this folder configurations. And inside here, let's create our breakfast configurations. And the way this is going to look is, let's say public class, and over here we want the breakfast configurations. And this is going to implement the entity type configuration, this thing for the type breakfast. And then if we implement this interface, then we see we have here the entity type builder, which if we're looking back at what we had before, then when we call this, then we get the exact same thing, which is the entity type builder. So it's just a cleaner way of doing the same thing. Okay, so let's go back to our breakfast configuration and put all the breakfast related configurations over here. Now let's open on the right the breakfast definition, just so we have a reminder of what we have. So we have the ID, the name, description, then we have 3 date times, and then we have these 2 lists. So we failed on the lists, so let's start with that. Okay, and so we're able to see something. Let me close this and let's make this a bit smaller. Okay, so we have here the builder. Now let's go ahead and configure how these savory and sweet items are going to be converted when we're storing them in the database. So what we want to do is the following. We want to say builder, and then we can say property and select the property that we want to configure. In our case, we want to change the savory items configuration, and we can say over here how we're going to store it in the database. So what we want to say is it has a conversion that on the way in, it's going to have the following conversion, yes, as GitHub Copilot is suggesting. So on the way in, we're going to take all the values and concatenate them with commas in between. Then on the way out, we're going to split it and store it that way. Great. So we have the conversion for the savory item. Let's do the same thing for the sweet item. Let's let GitHub Copilot write it for us. And great. So we have that. Now, other things that we might want to do is we might want to cap the length of the strings. So by default, when it's simply a string like this, then it uses the maximum value for the length of the string. So let's go ahead and say over here, builder, and then let's select the property that we want. In our case, we want the name, right? So let's say B, and then we have name. Then over here, let's say has max length, and over here we can say the maximum length. In our case, we can say that we have here the maximum values that are 50 for the name. So let's say over here, let's use it. For now, you can do whatever you want. Of course, this is just an example. So let's say over here, max name length, and that will be the maximum length for this. Let's do the same thing for the description. So let's say description, and then see over here, max description length. And that's the definition for 2 of these. Then we have here the ID that we are generating the value. So by default, it lets the database generate the value for the ID. So what EntityFrameworkCore does is it has a lot of conventions for various properties. So for example, if the name of the property is ID, then it knows that it's the ID for that entity. Now by default, it tries to generate a value for that ID. And because we're generating it ourselves, so if we go back to our constructor, so sorry, the screen closed, so let's open it again. We have here the breakfast object. And if we're looking at the create method that we're using to actually create the breakfast, then we see the GUID is optional, and when we don't pass it, then we create a new GUID. So because that's our implementation, let's go over here and let's say that the ID is never generated. So for that, what we want to do is we want to say property, and we want the ID, and what we want to say is that the value generated never, and then EntityFrameworkCore will know not to generate a value for it. We can also say explicitly has key and specify the ID, like was suggested before. And there are many, many configurations via the Fluent API, I think it's called the Fluent API of EntityFrameworkCore. And there are many things. Just explore the documentation, or when you're stuck about something, then just say Fluent API, whatever it is you're looking for. So it looks good. Let's try creating a migration again. So let's say over here, the same thing like before, and let's see if it worked. Okay, so it didn't work. And you might be asking yourself, why didn't it work? Because we have the configuration over here, and we're getting the exact same error like before. And the answer is that we haven't wired anything together. EntityFrameworkCore doesn't know to look for this configuration file. To do that, what we want to do is we want to go back to our Boober Breakfast DB context, and over here, call the on model creating, yes, and do the following. So GitHub Copilot is giving you spoilers, so I don't know if you like it or not. Let me know in the comments if I should disable GitHub Copilot. I'm not sure what I think about it for the tutorials. Okay, so we have the model builder, apply configurations from assembly. This will actually scan the assembly that we specify over here. In our case, it's the same assembly that the Boober Breakfast DB context is sitting in, and it'll look for all those entity type configuration files or the types that implement this interface, and then it will add those configurations. So now let's try calling the creating a migration again. Let's see if it works. Great, so this time it worked, and we can see a few things. First of all, we can see that we have a new folder that's called migrations, and another thing that we can see is that we have here some warnings, and the warning tells us that we are overriding the has conversion, but we're not overriding the comparer. So similar to how when you override the get hash code, then it wants you to override the equals as well, or vice versa. So it's the same thing. We're not going to do it in this video, but you can search online or ask ChatGPT. It's pretty simple. Okay, moving on. So we have here the migrations folder, and over here we have a few files. So we have the migration definition. We also have here the designer, and we also have here the snapshot. So starting with the migration, then we can see that this is the actual migration with the name that we give it. And underneath here, you can see what happens when the database tries to use this migration. That's in the up method. And over here, we could see that it creates a table with the name of breakfast. Now, it's very important when you're using EntityFramework Core to always look at the migration definition. You want to make sure that it looks like you want, because again, we're working with this very high abstraction of using LINQ and using syntax of C# as if we're working simply with objects, but behind the scenes, we're working with SQL, and it's important to understand the conversion between the two worlds. So for example, this might surprise you that the various datetimes are of type text and not something else. And the reason for that is because we're using SQLite, and this won't necessarily always be text. It depends on your database provider. So we have over here what we defined. So the maximum length is 50, like we wanted for the name. For the description, it's 150, like we defined. We have the ID that is a GUID, and we have here the two savory and sweet lists that are converted to strings. Okay, going down, then we have here the primary key, which is the ID, and then we have here what happens when you want to downgrade or when you want to go one migration back or remove a migration. Not sure what the correct terminology is. So what we do is simply remove the table. Okay, we have that. Moving on to the designer, then we can take a look what we have over here. So here we can see some other definitions. So this is similar to what we did in the configurations file. So we can see here the has maximum length, the column type, and so on, various things that correspond to what we did in the configuration file. And you can see that using reflection, it found all the various datetimes and added it as well. Okay, we have that. Then the last thing we have over here is the model snapshot, and it's similar to what we saw before. And it's a snapshot of what the model looks like. Okay, so we have all of this. Great, we have our migration. Now we should be able to create the database based on this migration. So again, currently we don't have a database yet. This is just a definition of the migration. So if this already existed, we had this thing, then we wouldn't need the design package, because the design package is used to generate these definitions, but it's not needed if you already have it. So let's say over here, .NET-ef-framework, and then we want to say database. And what we want to do is we want to create the actual database or to update the database based on the migrations. So let's say over here, Boober Breakfast, and then it will actually apply the migrations that we have. So running this, let's try running it again. So running this, then this should create the actual database. So let's see if this works. Okay, so it finished running, and we can see down here that we have a new file, which is our actual database. This, again, because we're using SQLite, then this is what was actually created. And we can take a look at what we have over here. There's an extension for Visual Studio that's simply called SQLite, and add this extension. Then once you have this extension, then you can say over here, open database, and this will let you choose the database that you want to open. And over here, this is the path to the file that was created. We select this, and then we have over here the SQLite Explorer that allows us to also look at the table definition. So everything we defined over here, look at the migration history, and we can also run queries against it. So we can create queries, or we can do show table, which will give us a visualization of the table. So we have all of this. Let's try running our service and seeing if it actually works. So let's say over here, .NET Run, and the project we want to run is the Uber breakfast project. So this will build and run our application. Let's let it run, and let's try making requests and seeing if it worked. If you're familiar with Entity Framework Core, then I encourage you to pause the video, think what might not work in the implementation that we had. Also, one thing that I wanted to say, and I forgot, is when you're applying the migrations, then you should always look at the output over here. Make sure that it looks like you expect. You don't want to have any surprises down the road. Okay, so we did that, and we can take down a notch the disclaimers. I think if you're watching this, then you got the idea. And let's try creating a breakfast. Let's see if this works. So let's put here something valid, because the name has to be at least 3 characters. So we have over here Vegan Sunshine. The description has to be at least 50 characters. So let's just put something here. Let's say, and seems long enough. Let's try running this and seeing if it works. So we can see over here the actual queries that were generated. So we can see we have here insert into breakfast, blah, 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 based on what we provided over here. And in the response, we see we got a valid response, which means that it worked as we expect. Let's take the ID that we just generated, and let's try retrieving this breakfast. So over here, let's paste this ID, and let's try retrieving it from the database, seeing if the get works. So we're running get, and we can see that over here, it executed the select, and we got the breakfast like we expected. So it was stored in the database like we wanted to. And if we're looking at the actual database, so we said we have here the visualization of the database using this extension. So we can see over here that this indeed is the GUI that we talked about with the values that we wanted. This is a great way, if you're working in Visual Studio Code, to get started and see what things look like using SQLite. You don't have to install any database. All you need to do is choose the SQLite provider. Okay, so we have this. Let's try deleting the breakfast and seeing if this works as well. So delete breakfast. Let's paste this over here. Try doing delete, and we get no content, which sounds good. So let's try retrieving the breakfast again. Let's say get, and we get breakfast not found, status code 404. That also behaves like we expect. Now let's move on to the upsert and see if the upsert works. So let's copy the ID, and let's try doing upsert. So I'm pasting the ID over here. I'm reminding you that we deleted this breakfast. It doesn't exist anymore. So creating it for the first time should return 201 created and return the same response like we got over here when we called the create breakfast. So we run this, and it was created like we expect. We get 201 created. The response looks good. Okay, now let's try updating it and giving it something else. Let's say Vegan Sunshine 2. And I want you to pause the video and think whether or not this is going to work if you're familiar with Entity Framework Core. And I'm being very discreet in my hints of whether it's going to work or not. So we're running this, and we get an error. So let's look what the heck happened. And we can see over here that we have some exception that says that the instance of type breakfast cannot be tracked because another instance with the same key value for ID is already being tracked. When attaching existing entities, ensure that only one entity instance with a given key value is attached. So let's go back to our breakfast service and understand what's happening over here. So let's close all of this. Let's go back to our breakfast service, and let's look at what we have in our upsert method. So we're looking at the upsert method. We have here the breakfast, and let's look at what we're doing. So a bit of background, again, this is an introductory video. So the DB context has a change tracker. So what happens is that Entity Framework Core tries to be as efficient as possible when it comes to the actions that it does against the database. So what we're doing over here, let's break it down from this new perspective. Then when we're calling find, then this returns a tracked object. So calling find won't only run the select query and it will return the breakfast, but also Entity Framework Core is now tracking this object, and any change that we do to this object is tracked. Okay, so we have this tracked object, and I'm reminding you that we're talking about the flow where the breakfast does exist, that is newly created is false, And over here, we're going to the update method. Okay, so what we have when we're arriving to this point is we're adding another tracked object to our breakfast DB set. And now what we have are two tracked objects with the same ID, and EntityFramework Core doesn't like the fact that it has two entities tracked with the same ID. So there are a few things that we can do. The first one is not tracking the breakfast over here. So if we aren't tracking it over here, then it knows that we're updating the breakfast with this ID. Okay, now there are other ways to do this as well, but let's look how we can do that. So let's start with the naive approach, and let's simply add here as no tracking, and this will tell EntityFramework Core not to track the object that's returned. But find isn't supported in this case because find is intended exactly for this, to retrieve an object and track any changes to it. So we can't use find anymore. Instead, we can use the first or default or select something else that is supported with as no tracking. So if we do this, then this will work. But what we have now, let's only change this to actually work. So I'll say b and b.id equals the breakfast ID. So let's make sure this compiles. Great, so this is the first option. But again, what we're doing over here is not only are we searching through the database to check if this exists, but we're also materializing the breakfast object that we aren't using, right? So if we're looking over here, we have this is newly created, or more correctly, we're creating this DB breakfast, which is based on what we just fetched, and we aren't using it. So if we're looking for usages of this thing, then we aren't using it anywhere. So instead, let's take a more efficient approach and use any. So let's say over here, any, and let's say any where the ID, yes, is the breakfast ID, and this will return true if it does exist, which means it's not newly created. So let's say not to invert this logic, and now this should work like we expect. And this is the reason why it's very important when you're working with EntityFramework Core to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes, whether or not you're doing one trip to the database, like we're doing in some places, like over here, for example, or whether you're doing two trips to the database, like over here, where we're checking if it exists, and then we're doing another trip to the database to actually update or create a new resource. And same thing goes for the other ones. So I really encourage you to always make sure that the queries look like you expect, have tests in place. This is something that I can't emphasize enough. So great, we did that. Now let's try running the application again and seeing if it works. So let's say run, and let's go over here. Let's go to the upsert, and now let's try creating again a new one with a new ID that doesn't exist. Let's wait for it to build and run, and let's try making the request. Great, so making the first request, then let's see if this works. Then yes, we get tool1 created, and the ID here is indeed the new ID that we just invented. It's Vegan Sunshine 2, so let's call it Vegan Sunshine 3 for the updated value, and we get no content, which sounds good because that's what we want. So let's try retrieving this breakfast now, and using the new ID, then we can see that it is retrieved. And if we go to our amazing SQLite viewer, then we can see that indeed it's sitting over here with the 1, 2, 3, with the new value and everything that we specified. Okay, the last thing I want to do is I want to attach the debugger, put a breakpoint, and to investigate a bit the various properties so you're more familiar with it. So let's go over here to the run and debug and select .NET Core attach. And now when we click play, then we need to choose which process we want to attach it to. In our case, we want to attach it to the Boober breakfast process that's running. This will attach the debugger to what we're running in the terminal. So now that we have that, let's make the upsert request again. So let's say upsert, and let's change this to 4 instead of 3. Let's make the request, and I forgot to put a breakpoint, so nothing happened. Let's go to the breakfast service, and let's put a breakpoint in the beginning of this method, and let's make the request again. Let's change this to 5, and let's hope this will be the last increment. So we hit the breakpoint. I want us to look at the DB context. So we have here our DB context, and like we said, there are a few things here that we care about. So we have the change tracker that we're already familiar with. We have here the breakfast DB set that we're also already familiar with. Okay, let's step over the is newly created line, and let's continue. We have that we know that it's not newly created, and over here we want to update the breakfast. And now we haven't called save changes yet. let's look at the change tracker. Okay, so opening the change tracker, then we have over here the non-public members that internally has the state manager, that internally has the entries, that internally has here the entry that we just modified. And if we look at the entry state, entity state, sorry, then we can see over here that it's modified, and Entity Framework Core has been tracking this object. It knows that it's modified, and now it knows that it needs to update it. So I think that's it for now. We'll dive into deeper things in the upcoming videos on the Boober Dinner project. So if you're not subscribed yet, then make sure to smash that subscribe button. So that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new. Let me know in the comments if you would have done anything differently. Also, if you have ways to make what we wrote today faster, less trips to the database, or in general, making the speed of what we wrote today faster, then make sure to put your tips below, because people watching this video are going to be people who are starting out with Entity Framework Core, and I'm sure they'll appreciate any tips, tricks, and anything else. Also, if it's something new that I didn't know, then of course I'd love to know about it and also present it in a future video. So that's it, and I'll see you in the next one.